Hello, and welcome to another book chat of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. My name's Jovan Maud, and today we're going to be discussing this book, Drama of Democracy, written by Lisa Björkman. And we have Lisa here today to talk about her ethnography of politics in the city of Mumbai. So Lisa is has a long-standing relationship with the Institute. She has been here several times as a senior research associate, and she's also associate professor of anthropology at the University of Louisville in Kentucky. So welcome, Lisa.
Thanks so much.
Okay. And we're also joined by another Lisa Mitchell, who is a professor of anthropology and history in the Department of South Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and also another long-standing associate of the Institute who's come as a regular guest since 2022. So welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
And I should say Lisa's work also has a lot to do with democracy in India. So it should be interesting overlaps between your work and Lisa's. And finally, we have a former researcher in the Department of Anthropology, Politics and Governance here at the Institute, Tyler Zoani, who is back here to chat with us. And Tyler is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Bremen in Germany. So welcome, Tyler. So Lisa, your book is an in-depth ethnographic look at the life of politics in the city of Mumbai. So you're approaching particularly this question of elections and the notion of representation and performance in the city. So can you talk a little bit about the background of the project, how it came to be, and what you're setting out to achieve with the book?
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining in this discussion. It's a tremendous pleasure and a privilege to be able to engage all of you. And thank you for reading the book. So this book was a long time in the making. The research for the book began when I had just finished up my doctoral dissertation. I began in 2011, in the winter of 2011, beginning with a return to the field site where I had done my doctoral dissertation fieldwork in the eastern suburbs of Mumbai. And then the research continued sort of episodically over the next almost decade until 2020. So, 9 years. And what brought me back, I'll answer your question by explaining what I went back to find, or why I went back to that neighborhood after I had just finished I just defended my doctoral dissertation. It was 2 weeks later, I think I was back in the field.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So when I did my doctoral dissertation was an ethnographic exploration of the kind of everyday politics of water access, and what the politics that makes water flow or not flow through the city and out particular pipes.
And that led to your book, Pipe Politics.
My first book was called Pipe Politics. And originally, when I had conceptualized that book and sort of outlined its method, I had been, and this was also, this is sort of what we do as anthropologists. We read a lot, and then we come up with, there was something I didn't quite understand. And I went back to try and figure that out. And what I was trying to understand when I began my doctoral fieldwork was the kind of politics that happens outside of elections, or the kind of, how does democracy inhabit the urban landscape outside of election season? And so I thought about water and the sort of everyday production of flows of water as like a really productive way to study that politics. And I thought water was really useful and interesting because everybody gets water every day. It might not be good water. It might be polluted. They might spend a lot of money. They might get it for free. But by definition, if you are a human being and you live in a city, you get water every day, pretty much. So the question was, what is that kind of politics, and what makes some water better than others? And, how does that happen?
Yeah.
And so, again, I started with this typology of there being a kind of like everyday politics outside elections. Yeah. And then very quickly, what happened when I got to Mumbai was that I realized that, this kind of assumption that I had unthinkingly made, that there was the politics of elections and then there was the politics of the everyday. This collapses ethnographically. First of all, because, elections happen so regularly in Mumbai. There's city elections, there's state elections, there's national elections, and they don't all happen at the same time. And so, I was in Mumbai over the course of 18 months during my doctoral fieldwork, and there were 2 elections that happened while I was in the field. There was a national election and a state election. And what I learned, not only during those election seasons, but the kind of characters who populated my ethnography of the, what I had been thinking of as the everyday politics of water outside elections, they were intimately connected with electoral politics, right? So like the elected corporator and the elected legislative assembly member played a very, very key role in this kind of landscape of actors and materials that made water flow. So when this kind of, this thing collapsed, this sort of distinction I had been making, then the question was, well, okay, I had this argument and this theory that I offered about pipe politics, and the way in which sort of political authority relates to the kind of material forms of power and practice that inhabit politics outside of election season. What happens during an election? And none of my research sites that I had selected to work on when I did the ethnography of pipe politics, I didn't explicitly focus on an election. And also I wasn't there during a municipal election. And the most prominent political actors were city elected officials. So I went back in 2011 to answer your question, to study an election. I was curious, all of these interesting plumbers and brokers and people who help register your kid in school, and all of these religious leaders and school teachers, what are they doing during an election? I know what they're doing to get water, but how does their kind of material authority relate to what happens during an election? And this was interesting to me because it seemed like what I had learned from pipe politics is that, yes, politics and, democracy doesn't only happen during an election, but an election is a really interesting and important moment within this broader landscape of politics. So the question I went back to Mumbai with was, what is the politics of an election? Yeah. So if everything is about politics, what is an election? Yeah. So that's why I went back. And then I hadn't thought of it as a book project at the time. I went with a very particular kind of question. And then every time I would go back over the following decade, I sort of went back because there was still a sort of itch to scratch. So there was a series of puzzles that I ended up sort of following over the course of the decade. And I didn't always go back explicitly to follow those puzzles. On some occasions, I went back for something unrelated. And yet I was still kind of futzing around with this thing. So it wasn't until the very end that I realized, not the very end, but at least 5 years in, that I realized I had actually, that there was a uniting question or problematic that was animating the book.
Okay, thanks. And I think we could get more into what it means to study elections ethnographically, which is I think a really interesting question, because what is an election? Where does it occur? What are the sites by which one can actually appreciate, what an election as a kind of social phenomenon is? And maybe I can bring in Lisa Mitchell, because you've also worked a lot on politics in India, more from a historical perspective. So what did you gain from the book?
Well, Lisa, you kind of ended your comments talking about puzzles. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about your scholarship is how central puzzles are as a kind of motivating mechanism for your research. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what the entry puzzle was for you, and then the new puzzles that you encountered along the way. As you've just said, you didn't really come up with the kind of overarching framework until very late in this book. And that's very different from your first book, Pipe Politics, where, we can maybe come back to method, but first let's start with your puzzles. What drew you in?
Thanks for that question. again, I mean, as I was mentioning in response to Jovan, to your question, the initial question that brought me back was really having realized over the course of my doctoral fieldwork, and while I was writing up that fieldwork in particular, where I ended up theoretically was with an election. So the conclusion of Pipe Politics talks about an election and the role of water workers. Like, why was it that, such a large number of the elected corporators or municipal councilors in the particular administrative district where I was studying got their start in water, right? So water became, and that was like a relatively new thing. It was like in the past 15 years. I mean, that book was published a decade ago, but in the previous 15 years, there was this phenomenon that the kind of political salience and import of that kind of expertise had a particular kind of salience or like rendered their power very useful. So people were very keen to put into office people who had connections with water. And so I was curious to sort of understand the relationship between those people and the election. But then, what ended up happening, when I was curious about what are all of these plumbers and brokers and so on doing, the very people who had been the kind of key actors in making water move when I was doing that work during that election became people who made other things move during the election. The first chapter of this book is about meanings of money, about cash money during the election. And a lot of the same kinds of people, I didn't work in the exact same neighborhood, it was the same area of the city, but the same sorts of actors in the water landscape were instrumental or were sort of key in making money move during the very intense 3 weeks of election season. So infrastructures of water turn into infrastructures of cash. And yet the puzzle that ended up animating that research, so that's why I went there. But then actually what I looked at, that actually ended up being a very concentrated, this is the thing about doing ethnography of elections, like a lot happens in a month. And then you've got to look at, everything else that happens. But during that 3-week season, I ended up being really interested after the election at the kind of disconnect between how much money was spent by the various campaigns and what the election outcome was. So very, simply put, the amount of money spent had no relation to how many votes people got. So this was interesting because a lot of the kind of popular and scholarly social science discourse, particularly in political science, about the problem of money, the meanings of money, have to do with that theories of vote buying. And the problem of vote buying, according to this sort of theory, is that it kind of evacuates or cuts the relationship of representation, right? If an election is meant to authorize a representative and then hold them accountable, by the temporality of the vote. If it's just a cash for vote thing, then it cuts it because the transaction begins and ends with the cash for vote. I give you money, you vote, the whole thing's done in a week. And so then democracy is evacuated of meaning, representation is evacuated. But what I found, so this is why it was so interesting to me, was that all of this money, a ton of money was made to flow. And yet it didn't seem to be buying votes. So what was all that money doing if it wasn't buying votes? And I wrote an article exploring this, back in 2014, a sort of initial exploration of this idea, which then I expand in the book in relation to the larger ethnography of representation, sort of theory of representation that the book is offering. So that was the kind of first puzzle. And what I learned in that chapter, of course, is that money is not doing this transactional work, although money is also used to buy stuff. Like you can, buy flags, or you can pay for police permissions to get a space for a rally, or, those kinds of campaign materials. But the key use of money was a sort of as a vehicle or an infrastructure of communication. It was a semiotic vehicle. It also worked like as a sort of Maussian gift to sort of forge relationships. So what I learned during that initial period of research was this intensive period is one of intense realignment amongst various kinds of ecologies of power wielders and important political actors, people like plumbers and, brokers of it, school teachers, people who have authority and knowledge that voters are very keen to, so people are keen to understand or seek advice from. There are particular kinds of persons of authority who voters would go to seek advice. Who is our candidate? Who should we support? Because, if somebody is a water broker, for instance, they are intimately in contact with all kinds of people in the public administration, with, potential providers of finance and funding, donors, people who can help out. So they're really good people, or contractors, particularly in low-income neighborhood, like building contractors. And I write about this in the first chapter of the book, are really, really good people to seek advice from. Because if you can build houses in a neighborhood where property right and entitlement is not always very clear, which makes construction vulnerable to allegations of illegality or encroachment, then being able to build a house, in order to build a house, you need to be able to access water, which is not easy to come by, sand, concrete, finance, all these. So if you're a contractor, it means you've got access to material resources. And if you can build them without them getting knocked over, it means that you're connected to all kinds of important bodies of knowledge of how to get permissions, of how to, liaise with the state's bodies in important ways. So, these ended up being extremely important people that people would forge relations with. Sorry, so a lot of the sort of gift giving. So the money, last thing I'll say about this, the money was doing this kind of communicative and semiotic work during the election.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, in you're describing that, we start to get a good sense of how your ethnographic work, staying close to people, following people through different interactions, helps you to see these different qualities of how, what money's actually doing on the ground. And so maybe I'll turn to Tyler and ask you, maybe just in a general sense, like how you responded to the book or what you found interesting.
And I think you just mentioned political science, and that's a kind of point of departure in the book for you. And what I thought about in reading the book was this Julia Paley piece that we, I think, know, some 20 years ago. She says, we have an anthropology of the state. We have an anthropology of activism. We sort of are beginning to study bureaucracy, but we don't really have an anthropology of democracy as such. And what would that mean? And 20 years later, until kind of recently, I would still say that's a question. That question could still be asked and not have a lot of good answers. But what is your answer to that question? What is it to do the anthropology of democracy? And what does that bring to the table that we don't already find in political science and political philosophy and some of those other conversations?
Thanks for that question. Thinking about anthropologies of politics and of democracy, there is a pretty lively literature on anthropologies of politics, which happen outside of democracies. Maybe like there's a lively literature on sort of anthropology of the state or of political authority or of sovereignty. And I think, part of what I was interested in Mumbai, and this is again where my first book in Mumbai left off, was that I ended up with the kind of sense or conclusion that people in Mumbai put democracy to work in surprisingly creative ways. And this was in a moment where, not only in India, but perhaps especially in India, there was a lot of cynicism about democracy. So I'll back up and say that a lot of the anthropology of democracy that I had been reading at the time was concerned with authoritarianism, about the kind of disciplining effect of power and politics, or the way in which politics was almost definitionally about the kind of performative enactment of sovereignty or authority, which was, I won't want to say non-democratic, but maybe non-emancipatory at least. And so what was so interesting to me as a scholar of Mumbai was that, I got this feedback from colleagues of mine working in other Indian cities about how optimistic my account or my experience of Mumbai was. Not that everything was always, amazing at all, but that there was a sense that people can put elections to work in ways that kind of challenge this idea that, politics forecloses democracy somehow. And so I became interested in what is it that people can do with democracy? Not that democracy necessarily does something. And there we get very different accounts of the way that elections would play out in different parts of the country. So, my colleagues working in Chennai or Delhi would sometimes say, well, that people don't use elections in quite that way, or why is this different in Mumbai? And I would say, well, I don't know. I mean, that would be really, I would love to read about, how these particular things play out. But I think what I find important in attending to democracy and elections ethnographically is that it allows us to understand change. It allows us to understand, I mean, I haven't used this word before, but I'll put it out there, agency, if you will, to a certain extent, the way in which people's lives and aspirations and ideas about the future are not sort of defined within structures or within sort of disciplining forces of power and politics, but in fact can act on those in creative sort of world-making ways. There was a kind of opening that I found really, I think, important to attend to, because I felt that if I wasn't paying attention to the hopefulness or optimism, that's the word, that people have in elections. It's not that everybody thinks that everything's going to be great, but people participate with extraordinary energy in elections. And I need to take them seriously. I can't say, well, everything is already foreclosed by money and power and, authority. Like, clearly there was something else going on that I wanted to understand. So
it seems like, much of what your book has been able to produce is due to its method. And I think what you were referring to earlier, the kind of anthropological obsession with power has often been a kind of top-down view of society, looking, drawing from kind of Foucauldian perspectives where the state is all about, expanding into every available crevice, power kind of from a top-down perspective. And I think what's really exciting about your book is that because you start with plumbers and contractors and, truck drivers and, people who are coming from some of the bottom stratus of society, and you're entering into the political from their perspective, I think it gives you a really different window on democracy. And I guess I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about how you conceptualize your method. I know, again, going back to pipe politics, one of the things I've really loved about that book and that I use when I'm teaching my own students is that you're very explicit about your method. You have that extra article that is on the Duke University website, kind of an extra chapter. And I always have my students read that because there you say, okay, I want to study water in Bombay. Where can I see how people get water? And you define very explicitly 8 different mechanisms or ways that people get water. And then you break that down into 14 different subcategories. And you say, how and where can I position myself so I can see each of these 14 different methods of getting water? And it's a very explicit method. And it's a method that really, from the outset, kind of conceptualized a plan. How do I gather data? And I guess I want to ask you how you conceptualize the method for this book, which really is maybe not as clearly conceptualized as a book from the outset and only kind of comes into being as a book later. How would you characterize your method in this book?
Thanks for that. And also thank you for assigning that article, which was, that article was a funny thing because it was actually my methods chapter of my dissertation, which, as we all know, gets sort of taken out. And then I was contacted by 3 different groups of PhD students who had read the book, everybody asking for my methods chapter. It's such a key question. What we learn is relating to, everything is about field site selection. What is the puzzle? And this is what I'm always trying to talk with my own graduate students about, you got to be really clear about the puzzle, because only then can you figure out where to stick your body in order to produce knowledge that might help you figure out what's going on. I don't want to say answer it, because a puzzle is not the same as a question, but figure out what's going on. So I would say that, for each of the kind of moments, and I was in Bombay every year between 2011 and 2020 without exception. I was there every year. And so this was a sort of longitudinal exploration of politics over that year. But every time I went back, and so there's three parts in this book. The first part focuses on the municipal election of 2012, winter 2012. Part 2, chapters 2 and 3, are looking at a municipal election in 2017 and contextualizing what I found against the backdrop of everything that I had learned during my fieldwork trips in between then. So again, like the politics of an election. And then the third part of the book is about a series of public protests that happened in the winter of 2019-2020. So during each of those moments, there was a puzzle that I was looking to explore, and a place into which I inserted myself. But I should say that, for just to speak about chapters 2 and 3, where I chose to situate myself was related to everything that I had learned in the 5 years previous to that. So for instance, I decided to look at that election, and most of the ethnographic content of those 2 chapters is during that month-long election season. But it was informed by everything that I had done in the run-up until then. So for instance, and just to come back to the question of money that I had started with in 2011, 2012, one of the curious uses of money that I had observed during that first election was that it's used as sort of wages, daily payments in compensation for people who participate in election rallies. So sort of paying for flag bearers, or paying people who assemble groups of flag bearers, almost like, paid extras on a stage set. So, one of the really interesting things that I found, and this was the puzzle that mobilized, or that sort of went into that second bit of research, was on the one hand, everybody knows that everybody's paid, right? That this is like an explicitly theatrical event, this political rally, or the sort of election rallies are theatrical in the sense that that there are people who are sort of employed to participate in a particular way. But nobody finds this either surprising or problematic. Nobody's pretending that they're not. Although, I think officially they're pretending that they're not saying that they are, because for all sorts of reasons that's not allowed. It's not a sort of acceptable expenditure. But everybody knows that these are sort of like paid extras on a stage set. And so I was curious about, like, what does this mean? How do we, what's going on here in a sort of crowd event or a political rally that is sort of explicitly marking itself as a piece of public theater? And then how are people experiencing it? And so this is back to your question of method, and also back to the question of, anthropology of democracy. One of the things that, and this is a sort of key insight that I came to throughout the research process and the writing, was that a lot of the kind of anthropologies of politics are interested in what people have talked about as performativity, which is the enactment of power, which in fact is power. So when you kind of, you enact power, and in so doing, the power then comes into being. And this is a word that comes from language theory and so on and so forth. And what was so interesting for me thinking about Mumbai, and thinking particularly about such ideas of, public performance and spectacle, was that the theory of performativity didn't allow for us to understand what seemed to me to be the most interesting thing going on during those events, which was how people were interpreting and receiving and experiencing what was going on. Which is to say, a theory of performativity assumes that a performance of power is power, without actually ethnographically exploring how people, like, maybe it's a farce, Maybe they like, what do they do with this? Do they like take a photo and send it to their friends? So we've got to look at, what the next sign, as it were, in order to understand the meaning of the performative enactment of power. And this brought me to performance theory. So what the book is trying to do is look both at kind of performative enactment, the kind of making of a sort of affective public spectacle, and also its myriad audiences, the many, many audiences, intended or otherwise. So this brought me into performance theory. And so my methodology, back to the question of site selection, was really about how am I going to position myself so that I can learn how people are experiencing and doing this work of kind of interpretation or meaning making or feeling of these things. So it was really the question of audience, which was the methodological kind of move, I guess.
Yeah, Tyler, would you like to come in on this?
Just to follow up on that. Yeah. I mean, the book sort of wonderfully takes seriously a lot of things that would be very easy to dismiss, that are dismissed locally as corruption, as cynicism, as this is just going through the motions, it doesn't mean anything. And equally, from another perspective, we could say this is dangerous populism. This could be authoritarian politics. Look at Hindutva. Lots of things would be easy to dismiss as potentially non-democratic or anti-democratic or something else.
Yeah.
But you take them very seriously as constitutive of democracy in contemporary Mumbai. And how did you get there? Like, how did you end up at a kind of taking a position which is actually quite against the grain?
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, and this is really what the book is trying to do. And so the whole book sort of came together through my sort of collective frustrations with the way in which sort of anthropological theory or political theory or social theory in general would seem to sort of have a concept through which it wanted to define or understand what was going on that didn't quite work. So for instance, just, back to the theatrical rally, which is the subject of, so chapter 2 is about the rally itself. It's about like what goes on that day. And then chapter 3 sort of takes a step back and looks at the 3 weeks and also 3 years, whatever, but mostly the 3 weeks of campaigning leading up to the assembling of that rally in order to ask, okay, like what is on display? If we're going to say that this is a stage, what is being shown and how is it put together and crafted? So, this idea of something as being theater in sort of democratic theory would often be counterposed with a sort of truth claim. So if something is not, real, if somebody is paid to be there, then it's a fake rally, right? So then we would get into this kind of like truth and lies or authenticity versus theater. And this was not the way in which people were talking about this. So, it was not, truth and lies. It was sort of like, well, truth, lies, and theater. And theater had its own sort of moral evaluative vocabulary. People would talk about theater. So it wasn't just like, oh, is it theater? Is it not theater? Okay, fine. So we're all on the same page that this is theater. Is it good theater? Is it bad? Is this an appropriate deployment of the affective entailments of theater? So there are appropriate and inappropriate deployments of theater. And so a lot of the discourse, the kind of moralizing talk, so this was one of my methodological focuses of this book, was really attending to what are people problematizing? And this is also a formulation that comes from Biao, who's part of our department. He talks about, Biao Zhang talks about problematization.
And part of the institute, yeah.
Yeah, part of our institute here. And I was influenced by his attention to actually attending to what are people saying is the problem here? Because, it's not that theater isn't a problem. It's just, it's not always a problem. There are certain problems with theater. The same way it's not that money is never a problem. There are appropriate and inappropriate deployments of money. There are appropriate and inappropriate deployments of the theatrical register. And again, there's like good and bad theater. Right. And the same way, most films are a flop. Most campaigns fail. Right. So just to say it's theatrical doesn't help us understand when people turn up on the street to watch a day full of rallies and then they sit around talking about like which one had the most takat, the most strength, which one, had the biggest image. Right. The sort of subtitle of chapter 2 is a quote from a an onlooker who is explaining to me. I asked him, like, what are you looking at when you're describing or when you're watching these shows? And he says, we're not looking at anything. It's just theater. He sort of dismisses it. And he said, everybody here is just paid to be here. It's just theater. And I said, okay, fine. But, you guys are still on the side of the road watching. So if it has no meaning, what are you looking at? And then he revises his estimation. And he says, well, you have to advertise. The rally is like an advertisement. You have to advertise, see, because no ad, no sale. And then he says that the size of the public is the size of the image. So I began to realize that, in fact, they were evaluating not only the empirical thing that was going on there, but actually the kind of like what is imaged, what is the kind of effect, the show itself was what was on display. So, and that was the kind of way in which people were engaging it. So that was, that was sort of where I ended up there.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've very nicely kind of captured what the book does, which is to move us to a different location of analysis. I'm thinking about the ways that things like the Occupy movement and the Arab Spring revived an interest in collective assembly in public space. But both of those sort of frame collective assembly as though in order to be authentic, it has to be spontaneous. And I think what your scholarship so beautifully shows is that all of the kinds of examples that you give are not spontaneous. They have, you meticulously kind of give us the backstory and the broader networks in which something that appears as a performance or as a collective assembly actually is built out of lots of different relationships over both short and long-term periods. And I maybe want to invite you to talk a little bit about the intervention that you see your book making within broader scholarship about what collective assembly is and what it does, and really challenging the kind of liberal framework of understanding the opposition between liberal and illiberal politics, which is also quite popular within certain schools of theorizing. What kind of intervention does your book make into that?
Thanks. I think this is a great extension of Tyler's question just now about the languages of kind of political analysis or of sort of moralizing about politics. And one of the things that I was very kind of frustrated with, I won't say frustrated, but sort of dissatisfied with or finding unhelpful was, again, the way in which crowd politics, and this comes obviously from your own work as well. And I was very grateful that I was able to sort of lean on the amazing history that you have very recently given us, where you give a genealogy of democracy in South Asia that doesn't begin with 18th century France and the so-called age of democratic revolutions. So, a lot of the kind of concepts, political theory, liberalism, the sort of diagnostics of politics that we end up with today in social theory in general come from formulations that are from the Enlightenment era, from the age of democratic revolutions, right? Where we have this theory of representative democracy, of representation, which is premised on the notion of absence. And this comes from Hannah Pitkin's work on the concept of representation, where it's always about the absent thing. And then it's always about, okay, so what is the absent thing? But the idea that like representation entails representing or making present that which is not there is the kind of heart of liberalism. And so this is where the crowd becomes a real problem in, if you begin with liberal political theory, when there's not, the whole point of the age of democratic revolutions was, you cut off the head of the king and then you end up, there's not an embodied people. And so when the people finds itself physically amassing in public space, this is a sign, according to liberal theory, that like something is broken with democracy. Something has gone amiss because like that space is not meant to be occupied. There's meant to be representation. So this means either the authorization accountability mechanism has broken down or something about representation has gone wrong. Now, of course, as you've shown so beautifully in your book, the kind of genealogy of that form of sort of collective assembly as an infrastructure of political communication and claims making predates the age of democratic revolutions. So we can do a genealogy of, I don't want to say democracy, but of representation in South Asia that doesn't begin with the kind of normative frameworks that come out of 18th century France, the age of democratic revolutions, and the way that which those have been kind of normalized and institutionalized in democracies all over the world. So we end up with like the crowd is just doing something really different. And that is not to say, and this is to come to your point about, the sort of authenticity versus theatrical thing. Like if that's not the moral evaluative vocabulary, is it a real crowd, like a spontaneous crowd, right? Because this is the kind of, where liberalism would critique, would say like the crowd is a sign of broken democracy, a sign of populism, right? It means that the democratic relationship is broken down. Then the sign of the crowd is also a way in which the people is making itself heard. It must be spontaneous. It must be in order for it to provide this sort of voice from outside. But if that's not what's going on, if the game in town isn't authentic versus fake, then what is the evaluative vocabulary? And so that's what I think the final part of the book. So I should say the final section of the book focuses on a season of mass political protest against a constitutional amendment that was passed in 2019. And when I had come to Mumbai that fall, it was actually before the bill became a law. So I didn't, and before the sort of season of protest had started. So I had been planning to sort of flesh out a bit more about, okay, what's the difference between, different forms of theatricality in Mumbai? I was sort of trying to trace the genealogy of this sort of performance register. And then all of a sudden, the entire country, not just Mumbai, explodes in this season of mass political protest, which was shut down by the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns. But for 4 months, the streets were full of crowds of sort of mass political assembly, but they were very, very different from the ones that I had been studying during the election, not because they professed to be spontaneous. They didn't at all. They were orchestrated. They advertised their police permissions, their organizing committees, they were very like invitations, instructions. They were clearly planned events. They weren't spontaneous in the sense of just people pouring into the street. And yet they were not theatrical in the same way. They weren't, and this was actually quite interesting what I talk about in chapters 4 and 5, is how one of the kind of ways in which people sought to kind of put down or undermine the legitimacy of these protests, and there were protests on both sides. There were some smaller sort of pro-amendment rallies as well, was people were saying that the protesters or that the participants were paid. And this was never really anything that I had heard during an election campaign because, that was sort of part of what was going on. That wasn't the moral evaluative. People were evaluating it in different ways, not whether or not there was money. But this was different. And it absolutely was a show in the sense that when I say show, I'm relying on Richard Schechner's work where he talks about performance being showing doing. So the more explicitly one shows what they're doing, the more one is performing. So what was being shown at the different events was the key. And yet it was a very different kind of moral evaluative register. So again, back to your point, Tyler, like what I do in each of the chapters of the book is each of the chapters is animated or mobilized around a problematizing emic concept keyword. The last chapter of the book, the sort of problematizing word is political or politics. So one of the ways in which people would sort of, one of the sort of epithets that people would throw around about these protests was, oh, this is political. And I was curious, well, what does this mean to say the protest? First of all, how can a mass mobilization orchestrated by political parties in opposition to a constitutional amendment sponsored by the ruling party. How can this not be political? Like what's going on? And so what they meant by political was, and this comes back to the discussion of theater. It had to do with by accusing something of like playing politics. This is what they would say. They're playing politics, and playing is not incidental here. It meant that they were doing theater, doing natak, but without in an inappropriate space. So they were mobilizing affect, the kind of affective emotionality of mass politics, but deploying it cynically in order to do a kind of like self-aggrandizing, so that certain people, like they're just using this occasion as a, like this, amendment or whatever it is, to sort of rouse up emotions and sentiments, religious sentiments or fear-mongering or whatever it is, in order for like a narrow electoral gain. So the allegation or the accusation of playing politics was about an inappropriate mobilization and deployment of the affective affordances of theater, of drama in that. And so this was the game.
Can I ask something? I mean, I think this was very helpful also thinking about Lisa Mitchell's book and this effort to get outside the parochialisms of Euro-American political thinking and thinking about other idioms, other practices of doing politics, of doing democracy. And I think your book is very compelling in establishing here is a democratic practice and here is what democracy looks like in Mumbai on its own terms, and not dismissing a lot of things that would be easy to dismiss. I also know that you're a very committed ethnographer. And so you're careful to bound your argument to the ethnography you did. But if you, are there things you might hope people who want to study democracy elsewhere take away from the book? What would those things be? And just in general, any kind of larger implications for thinking about democracy and maybe even doing democracy elsewhere in the world? And it's a bit of an unfair question because it's not the book that you've produced, but...
No, but Tyler, you're exactly right that, in thinking again back to Lisa's question about how the book came into being and in relation to, this decade of research, which was so different from my first book. I think the moment when I realized this was a book was when Donald Trump was elected to office the first time in 2000. Sort of, what I had been thinking about, like kind of some odd quirks of Mumbai's political scene that I was sort of curious whether they resonated in Chennai or West Bengal or whatever. Suddenly, this became extremely interesting with the potential to maybe offer conceptual tools to think through what was going on in contexts like, say, the United States. So, for instance, just to give one example that I actually do reference in the book itself, the discussion of the size of rallies. So this was something that got a lot of attention in the U.S. About the kind of wild disconnect between what the Donald Trump was saying the size of his rallies were and what technology showed us was reality, like wild overstatements. And yet the response from the opposition in America was always fact-checking. And what was so interesting to me was in Mumbai, when somebody would say something which was patently untrue, the response from the opposition would never be fact-checking because it wasn't about truth and lies, right? So if somebody says something which is not a truth statement, it could be inhabiting a theatrical register, right? And so this is why it has a sort of affective force. So the question then wouldn't be like, why do people really believe there was 10 billion people at the rally when clearly there weren't? The real empirical or ethnographic question would be, what does that statement mean? Like, how do people experience that? And why is that meaningful or effective? Like, what sense are people making of this? How do people sense this? Even if it's not meaning, like, what is the sort of affective experience of hearing that? Because that's the register within which these kinds of speech acts are being made. And so, and I'll just give a little vignette from, this is from chapter 3, the title or the kind of keyword is believe. And it's about what is to be believed and how people navigate. And people talk about, the difference between what is what is a show and what is a lie, and how people navigate what is to be believed, particularly through social media, and people, how they do this work of interpretation, or contextualizing sort of snippets of information, what comes through like a WhatsApp clip. People make sense of and interpret, not is it true or is it not true, but what does it mean in the context of like all of the kind of sensory infrastructure available to me, the street, my, the whatever's going on, everything that I'm experiencing. I'm not just going to look at this one tiny thing. So, I think one of the reasons I think Mumbai and Mumbaikars that I've been working with are so extraordinarily fluent in communication, political communication, and also the using social media within that broader material landscape. It's not that social media is over here and, everything else analog, straight, the street and the screen are not part of separate worlds, but people are interpreting the screen through the streets that they're looking at their screens while they're standing on, as well. Oh, so in this little vignette, there is a video, a negative video, which is circulated over WhatsApp during the campaign that I'm following. And then the way in which the campaign team counters the video, the negative video, isn't by saying, nuh-uh, no, it's not true, but rather they produce a counter spectacle, which has a different kind of affective affordance or register, which counters the negative valence or the negative experience, or the what is perceived to have been the kind of emotional or affective encounter with that video that posed a danger to the campaign. And so they never tackle directly. They don't fact check because they understand that that's not the way that this is going on. So, I think your question is such an important one, in terms of how can we, in general, maybe become more attuned to contextualizing or understanding speech acts that aren't sort of meaningful only in their semantic value, but the way in which, and it raises very different kinds of questions for anthropologists and also for, citizens about, how we make sense of what people are saying.
Okay. And I think, and starting to, move towards a conclusion of the talk, it's been really fascinating. Maybe I could just ask for a final observation from Lisa and Tyler, or a final comment?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for the discussion just now about belief. I think so much of the conventional wisdom about populism worldwide assumes that voters are duped. Mm-hmm. And I think what your book really does so beautifully is to show that ordinary people on the ground are not being duped by politicians, but in fact are very sophisticated readers of these semiotic performances. And I guess I would maybe ask one last question, which is, what can scholars of democracy or political performance elsewhere in the world take away from this in order to recognize the very sophisticated work that ordinary voters and ordinary people are engaging in?
And maybe wrapping up, Tyler, is there anything you'd like to add that, and maybe Lisa can respond to both?
I don't know if that's hopeful or scary. Actually, no, but we end.
Yeah. I think in some ways your question answered, entails or has the answer that I would offer, which is that I think that the biggest mistake that we as scholars and researchers and as people who care about democracy can make is to think that people are stupid or that they're duped. And this is something that we hear a lot, particularly from people coming from people critiquing those who are supportive of right-wing politics, of authoritarian politics, that, they're duped or they're stupid or they're ignorant, or this is what happens when you defund public education, or and I think that some of the more interesting research, I'm thinking of Anand Pandian's work on where he sort of does a road trip across America in order to really understand people who are supportive of right-wing politics in that country right now. And I think that's extraordinarily important to understand what people are finding meaningful. Again, back to this claim of there were 10 billion people at my rally. Like, what are the kind of grievances or aspirations or hopes that are behind those, in order that they might be addressed in a way or spoken to in a way which is democratic and hopeful.
Okay. So maybe we can finish on a hopeful note, perhaps. Yeah. In fairly dark times at the moment, politically speaking. Yeah. I'd like to thank you, Lisa, for coming and talking about your book, and thanks to Tyler and Lisa Mitchell for for your comments and questions. And I think what this book really demonstrates is just how valuable an ethnographic take on something like an election is. How you get a certain kind of handle, a certain kind of purchase on it that you just can't get through other forms of inquiry, and the way that focusing on the particular, like you do, does enable us to maybe think in other ways about more the general as well. So doing that sort of exemplary thing, I think that good anthropology does. Thank you very much, and I'll wrap it up now and say thank you for watching, and till next time.